I'm now going to say something that will astonish you.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
I have a dream.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
We are living in an increasingly polarized world.
My administration has accomplished more than almost any administration.
We must begin now.
Welcome to the Bulletin podcast.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new season of the Bulletin podcast. This is your producer, Hussein Al-Mallah, and here's what's coming up.
Digitalization can be seen as kind of a shock that comes from outside to the system. Yeah, it does have these potentially dangerous and negative consequences of not only increasing efficiency but also increasing a digital divide.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Bulletin podcast. In this episode, we will be moving on to our new theme of the year, development. As you guys know, we have divided this year into multiple themes, where each theme will take on multiple episodes and we will discuss different topics relating to the bigger theme. Our first theme was all about digitalization and the different aspects that come about it, from protecting yourself online to protecting your facial identity and the tracking that happens on behalf of the state. Now, we will be moving on to our topics of developments. Hello everyone, I am your host Hussein Al-Mallah and I am joined by
Jesus Renzulo. Yeah, right, Hussein. We are going to talk exactly now about development and, in fact, a middle way between development and digitalization. That is, how the state digitalizes and how does this affect the welfare state, which is a growing topic and really important nowadays.
Yes, actually, I do remember we had a couple conversations about that specific topic in our leadership class, in our leadership and management class, where we were discussing maybe our experiences from our home countries and our experiences coming to Germany and this whole process of digitalization of the state that is taking place in Germany. What do you think about all that? What was your experience with that when you first came here?
Well, in fact, Germany is, from my perspective, is not such a digitalized country. Mm-hmm. Venezuela used to be more digitalized, and that make the worry of Venezuelans of how surveyed are we. And I think that's the worry of many developing and developed countries, not only from the state, but also from companies. And that's why I think this topic is so important and so interesting.
Mm-hmm. Do you think when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to saying, a lot of people say digitalization reduces bureaucracy, while others say, on the other hand, no, it increases the bureaucracy and the processes. What do you think about this whole process?
Yeah, of course. I think that any digitalization process starts with that, with bureaucracy just saying, I want to do the same, but now in a computer. And I think that's the first stage of digitalization. And that becomes even more burdensome to some extent, because you have these old bureaucrats that don't know what they're doing with a computer and a new system and an old system that are trying to converge. But maybe that's part of the growing pains of digitalization. I don't know. I think that I would need an expert to know more.
Then we're very lucky that we have our interview coming up. In this episode, we will have our interview with Professor Achim Kemmerling. Professor Kemmerling is going to be introducing his new volume that is going to be coming out, which is the Digitalization and the Welfare State. And for those of you who are not familiar with him, Dr. Kemmerling is the Gerhard Haniel Chair of Public Policy and International Development at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, where he actually also serves as its director. We are very excited for the interview that's coming up. The topics that they talk about in this new volume have been specifically interesting. He sent us a preview of the introduction, and I was very intrigued. It felt like we are reading something when it comes to digitalizing the welfare state that is bound to happen, that it's not something we can stop. But reading about it really helps to know how to deal with it in the future, and it helps really put an idea of how you can comparatively see digitalizations between different states. What did you think?
I think it's going to be a great ride with Dr. Kemmerling in this interview, and I'm really hoping to see his insights on the matter.
Awesome. So with that, I say let's just dive right into our interview. All right, everyone, welcome back to the Bulletin podcast. Today, we are joined here by Professor Kemmerling for our interview. Professor Kemmerling, thank you very much for joining us on the Bulletin podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Great. I think we can just dive right into it. We want to make every minute of this interview we have really count. So let's start really quickly. We had a look at the volume that's going to be released soon by you. So how about we just start this interview by giving our listeners a quick intro on what this volume is going to be about?
Sure, happy to. So this is the title is Digitalization and the Welfare State, and it's forthcoming with Oxford University Press. It's an edited volume, so it has lots of contributions, 21 in more detail, and the authors come from all major OECD countries, I'd say. So we have contributors from United States, from many European countries, also Eastern European countries, and so on and so forth. But I would say it's core OECD, let's say. So this is also what the volume mainly talks about, namely established welfare states. So kind of traditionally, let's say bigger, larger welfare states, and also with some experience in running. Question probably is what it means a welfare state. Well, a welfare state means kind of all kinds of social policies, labor market policies, also education policies, which are also talked about in this volume. And we also included taxation issues because the financing of the welfare state is also an important topic. But the volume not only speaks about digitalization of the welfare state in this sense, but also the politics behind it. So what could digitalization and technological change in general mean for also, for instance, support coalitions, those who advocate for more or less social policy? How are they shaping up as an effect of technological change? So just very briefly, what we mean by this is kind of the latest round of innovations in that sector. Digitalization is kind of a placeholder for many things, but what we mainly had in mind is automation processes, for instance, namely in the form of bots and robots that really are going to reshape the way how work commonly is done and defined. So this is a major issue, but we also include things like platform economies, namely, where there is a different form of arrangements between buyers and sellers of some services. You can think about, eBay, but also now all these kind of click work agencies and stuff like that. And we also talk a little bit about algorithms and deeper forms of maybe not artificial intelligence in a very general sense. So basically the machines taking over completely, but at least in an isolated way, algorithms as forms of technological change that also will affect the way how we do labor market policies, social policies, tax policies, etc.
And it also covers how the digitalization can increase or reduce accessibility to these social programs and social welfare state.
Yeah, perhaps. So one interesting differentiation which is done in the book is the differences between internal and external forms of digitalization, let's say, or modernization. What this means is that digitalization can be seen as kind of a shock that comes from outside to the system. And then we mainly talk about what this does to, for instance, the number of jobs in a society, the type of jobs in a society, whether it has an impact on inequality in an economic sense and maybe even also in social sense. And then the ramifications for first the politics of the welfare state, and then for the basically the types of policies one needs to have in place in order to counter perhaps some of the less benevolent side effects of digitalization. So that's the external part, but the internal part mainly refers to what digitalization means for service delivery itself in the welfare state, right? And on both fronts, we see very different results for different countries. So, I mean, Germany is, for instance, one of these more sluggishly implementing countries when it comes to welfare services. I think Corona also kind of shows this, that the reservations about digitalization in health policies, for instance, is much higher than, let's say, in Scandinavia, which basically is a region where data privacy issues are less of a problem for most people, and therefore also the digitalization of the health service is much more advanced than in other countries.
That is extremely interesting, and I really like that you mentioned the German case because there's this idea that digitalization of welfare state and of public systems in general is presented as an altruistic and noble enterprise designed to help citizens get the benefits of new technologies. But in reality, it also can often reduce budgets, restrict eligibility, and produce even fewer services. Does that hold true in the German case? Is that the case in Germany?
A little bit for the reasons I just mentioned. I'm not so sure whether we see the full wrath of digitalization in full swing, let's say, in the German case so far. We do see occasional hiccups, but I think digitalization has not made the same kind of inroads into the system that we see in other places. For instance, in the Netherlands, the incumbent Dutch government has a big scandal, and the main issue behind the scandal was the use of algorithms in granting or rejecting proposals for social minimum assistance. So basically, people would want to qualify for social minimum assistance, and then a computer algorithm kind of decided whether or not to grant this. And the scandal was that a lot of people from migrant families, or maybe second, third generation of migrant families, got kind of automatically automatically delisted from this. Because, I mean, this could be even constructed as fraud cases, essentially, as falsely claiming benefits where none there no entitlement should be. And this is interesting because this made even the government stumble, because obviously these we know all about these biases in algorithms, but in this case it had severe consequences for people in these services. And the Dutch case is not the only case. We know this from a lot of countries that have digitalized their social services. For instance, in the UK, we see things like that happening. But even India, I mean, the volume mainly talks about OECD countries, but there have been dramatic consequences coming out of this Indian aggressive move towards e-citizenships and the digital registration of the population. And whoever is not in there essentially cannot qualify for food stamps programs or anything like that. So basically basic social minimum programs that are deciding on survival of people very often. So yeah, it does have these potentially dangerous and negative consequences of not only increasing efficiency, but also increasing a digital divide. So for whatever reasons, people who are not apt or not willing to participate in the digital version of this service delivery might be cut off.
So it's also a matter not only of implementing digital services, but also of reducing the digital divide and creating digital inclusion, which is another set of policies.
Yes, exactly, and there it's again very interesting. So we have a quite interesting chapter on education, where you see not only now because of the corona or the COVID crisis, but also even before, there's now a strange mixture between who's actually doing the services, right? So in a lot of continental European countries and also Scandinavia, the idea is that the welfare state is really a government institution. So essentially that most of these kind of activities fall under the responsibility of government-led or publicly led, or maybe quasi-governmental organizations. So schools are usually public, hospitals are public, etc., etc. But when you think about digitalization, a lot of these platforms, of these new tools of e-learning, they are either NGO driven, so non-profit driven, but mostly they actually have commercial purposes. And then you have all of a sudden all these problems balancing a little bit the commercial interests with, again, issues about data secrecy, about what is actually good for students and what's good for the system, and that's very hard to sort out. It's really a new challenge for the education systems in many countries.
I think that's very interesting that you mentioned all these new challenges coming up, which brings me back to a very interesting paragraph you had in the introduction to the volume, which was titled "Optimists versus Pessimists. Is it different this time?" What do you think? Is it really going to be different this time, or are we just going to fall through the same pits we fell through before?
So, one thing, maybe as a general caveat, social scientists are always better in identifying problems than solutions, and also kind of being excessively negative about things. But I think there's also a reason for that. Human beings are risk averse on aggregate, or in general, let's say, so they fear negative consequences more than they hope for positive consequences. And this might be even an evolutionary trait of human beings. So I think it's in any of these kind of big technological revolutions, it's always good to be a bit on the cautionary side of things. So I think that's not per se bad. And yes, I do think that this time will be different, although if you think about it, if you go through the history of the welfare state in OECD countries, in, let's say, advanced or richer countries, then all kinds of sectoral change had always tremendous implications for the welfare state. So if you think about it, the cradle of the welfare state was industrialization, namely the move from agricultural societies to industrial societies. The next big challenge was essentially deindustrialization. So how do countries deal with the fact that manufacturing jobs are stagnating or maybe even going down in a lot of countries? And this meant that there were tremendous demands from those losing jobs towards the government. What should we do, essentially, right? And so this required retraining measures. This often led to early retirement schemes, which then made the government budgets explode. So there's all these kind of effects, even in previous rounds. This time we could speak of a certain type of detertiarization, if you want. So basically a big change in the service sector itself. Moving away from certain types of service activities, perhaps moving into other service activities. There will be also new types of jobs. Some of them are quite interesting just to observe. So it's not all doom and gloom. So, there's a lot of people who now really work the internet well and make a lot of money, for instance, from it, right? So it's not all bad, but given that it's going to be sectoral change, so some sectors disappear and some will arise, this will again create tremendous frictions. And the other thing, what is really dear to me, is that the speed of change is also very fast. So think about all these people who are now Uber drivers in those countries where Uber actually exists, unlike Germany, let's say. It might well be then in 20 years' time, they might again lose their jobs, because then we only have automated cars. Might be a bit on the optimistic side here, or pessimistic, whatever you want to think. So it might go actually slower than one might think. But you see this, that it's actually even hard to create occupations if the occupations themselves only last for 2 or 3 decades, right? And this is a tremendous issue for skill formation systems. So what should you train? You can essentially, in these cases, you can only train very general skills, but not very job specific skills if the jobs disappear in 10, 15 years again. So these are the issues where I think it's really different, and which is a big challenge for societies, how to cope with these issues. And the other thing perhaps which also makes it a bit different is that this form of more or less intelligent automation systems, in a sense, doesn't have a limit to it, right? So in the past, the human society could always cope with the change, and at some point they created new kinds of activities. But this time could be a bit different because, essentially computer programs, algorithms could do whatever you can imagine them doing, right? So in the sense that, they can be creative for writing songs, for instance, or poems or stuff like that. The sky is the limit here. So in that sense, I think it's I don't want to sound overly bleak, but it is a real fundamental thing we are seeing
Yeah,
here.
yeah, and in
Yeah.
terms of technological, here's like a funny little thing I saw just this morning, actually. It's funny that you mentioned about the technological advancements. I saw this new website that they're trying out where you just put in a few keywords and it will write a full-on essay on these keywords. And that was shocking when I saw
Wow.
people trying it out. Yeah, we live in a new era, I guess. But if we really want to divert back to the state, and a lot of people argue that digitalization will eventually kind of destroy the social state in terms of also having all these information and the concentration of data being in the hands of very few monopolies that can sometimes evade the state. Are those concerns justified?
Um, Again, so so we are just writing on the conclusion, or actually we have
Hmm.
now written the conclusion. And one thing which we wanted to highlight is that welfare states are also sturdy beasts. So it's very hard to kind of kill
Hmm.
them, right? Because they are in place in those places where they work moderately well. And I think that's true for most OECD countries. They also create a lot of demand and a lot of support. So it's not that we will see them going out of the door from one day to the other, but there is kind of problems attached to new technologies, as always, that are changing and challenging the fundamentals of the welfare state. So one thing is, for instance, that we see all these kind of social insurance companies, for instance, in the US nowadays, they ask their members to wear essentially activity trackers. So basically, they ask their clients to report in very detailed terms on their personal health. Uh,
Mm.
every day, every minute of their life, if you want. And if you agree to that, you get a much lower premium. So you have to pay much less money. But in that sense, it counteracts one of the basic principles of social insurance, namely the pooling of risks and of solidarity. So that's one thing. And there's other things also, this kind of, also a little bit in more general, what we observe with the use of internet, there is kind of a little bit of an isolating tendency of using all these forms of technology, which also in a more fundamental sense could challenge the basic sense of solidarity. So, it's really interesting to observe these processes. Again, people also freaked out about the use of television, so we also need to be realistic, right? Hopefully, these are also kind of hiccups and unintended side effects of technologies. Societies will once again get used to and make the best out of it, but I think there's some real concerns for the design of social and labor market policies in that
I
regard.
think if so insurance companies ever track my movements, my tariff would go up and not down. In my case, it will not be going down.
Oh God. I really like how you talk about these being hiccups, like these fears of the social state going down and how it's a story to beast. But something that we have seen a big trend is how digitalization has increased energy consumption and the worries that the environment might face, or the threat that the environment might face with this increased digitalization. Do you think that digitalization is indeed like environmentally unforgiving or unconscious?
Um, to a certain degree, I think yes, it's a good question you raised there. And to be honest, we were not very explicit about this in this volume because we really talked about the core functions of the welfare state. But it's a fascinating topic. I'm not really an expert on this, but what I see. So yes, in general, that should be also a concern. Also, kind of mainstreaming all these climate change issues should be done in all stretches of life and in all parts of governmental policy making. Um, where I see more specifically, or when I really think about the kind of technologies you could think of, yes, there might be I mean, all these activities lead to an uptake in terms of energy consumption. But what are really, I think, those kind of activities that require a lot of data are streaming activities, right? And to certain degrees, maybe in modern medicine, maybe in schooling, I think there could be real energy burners if you want. But the kind of digitalization I mainly had in mind in terms of internal modernization, right? We talk now about transformative services, have to do with data management systems. And okay, they also require server spaces, but they also kind of would offset certain tendencies. You know, in former times, a lot of paper had to be shipped around between offices or between, for instance, just as an anecdotal piece of evidence, I now need to ask my former Berlin doctor to send all the documents to my Erfurt doctor. You know, in as an mail or email, who knows? But
The box.
you know, there is a lot of paper-based waste essentially also in the system. And I think in that regard, I'm not so sure about the CO2 balance. But yes, I mean those things that are fancier, like long distance operations in the medical system, I think they will require a lot of additional energy. But even then, I'm not always sure to what degree they would offset certain types of activities and that also might be energy consuming. But the agenda is a fascinating one. I think there's a real need here also for making this transition, the internal modernization, as climate change friendly as possible.
It's impressive how many things we talk about the welfare state, but there's so many things to take into account. We need to think about energy, inclusion, digitalization, all culture. It's impressive how many things we just cover.
Yeah, definitely. It's a very complex area, but this is the complexity of modern policy making. This is normal. This is why it's so difficult to do a government's job, essentially.
Yeah.
I'd really like to conclude here with, if you want, a sort of opinion question, if you may. And I really want to know what you think is the potential that digitalization holds for economic development in specific.
You mean for essentially for the larger society's economic
Precisely.
potential? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think there will be knock-on effects. So as I said, I think the two things that welfare scholars usually worry most is potential job losses and the way how to recover them. Or if that's not really possible, how to transform a society from a work-based society to what I call an activity-based society, namely where societies value being active, but also making sure that it's not only those scarce few jobs that the market system, for instance, regards highly as the only forms of activities that create value, right? So it's quite obvious that, for instance, in the COVID crisis, we see that once again, those sectors who earn relatively little are quite essential to the system, but don't get really the kind of remuneration which would match the exposure to the risks involved or the stress levels involved. And these kind of things, so digitalization could really be a positive shock in that sense, making us reconsider what we value as societies, and not only in financial terms, in general terms. So I think that's something like maybe a little bit of an utopian, but not so far ahead kind of a future, which digitalization could also lead to. And I think that's quite a positive scenario, even if it sounds scary in the short run. But in general, yeah, digitalization has created a lot of economic value itself. This is perhaps the irony. So that so in former times, for instance, economists would always presume that services are not very productive. You know, there's this, I don't know how much of details you know about economics, but there's this famous Baumol's cost disease argument, namely that, for instance, in countries that are rich, a haircut costs much more than a haircut in a country that is poor. And that comes from the fact that basically everybody else makes so much more money that even a hairdresser needs to have better wages in order to compensate. But in a sense, this makes these services very costly because they are not don't match the productivity level of manufacturing jobs or computer IT sector jobs or something like that. And this is also why we see that all these service jobs then disappear, because they become relatively too costly. So people buy their own little devices to cut their hair, or they, for instance, nobody would work as servants in households any longer in these richer societies. Obviously, there is still household work, also professionally paid, but it's much less than in poorer countries. So these things happen, but digitalization once again showed that this is not necessarily the case. Nowadays, actually, services can be highly productive. You can outsource them to a very distant place for minimum wage if you want. So, for instance, even IT coding or programmers or something like
Indeed.
that. It could be very cheap in principle because you outsource it to a place where there's lots of them and they're doing it very cheaply. But also on the efficiency and productivity side, now, for instance, you can theoretically record a classroom session and stream it to millions of people across the whole world. And so it's tremendously productive. So the old saying that a service basically perishes in the act of consumption is no longer true. You can repeat services ad nauseam if you want. And that's only one of the things why actually prosperity is probably not the issue related to digitalization. So there's still a lot of money to be made in a very digitalized world. The question, as always, is whether everybody benefits from this and to what degree, and what government policies should do in order to make sure that everyone gets a fair cut of these benefits, because otherwise we run the risk to see what's happening on right now, right? You see that certain companies have tremendous profits even in this crisis, and others are basically going out through the door, essentially.
Yeah, speaking of barbers, I remember when I told my barber back in Beirut how much I paid for a haircut here, he immediately started his immigration papers. He did not want to be there anymore.
Yeah, that's funny. That's funny because haircuts is one of those jobs that are not automatable in the near future, at least, right?
Professor Kemmerling, thank you very much for joining us on the Bulletin podcast here today. Reading the introduction has left me personally with many questions, and I'm very excited for the full volume to come out. This is something, the digitalization of a welfare state, I'm sure it's something that is inevitable. So it's very important that we understand what's coming our way. So we thank you very much for your time and this insight, and we look forward for the release of this volume.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to plug the book. The book will still probably take a couple of months before it's out, but we will let you know once it's there.
Awesome, very exciting. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Wow, that was such an interesting interview. I had a great time. What did you think of that?
It was simply amazing, not only to understand how many variables need to be aligned in order to digitalize correctly a society and a government, but also the problems and the threats that this encompasses. It's simply amazing.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I actually did not think that there were so many different layers one has to consider when we talk about the digitalization of the state. I think that was the point, my learning point or outcome of this interview. It was very interesting to me to be put aware of this. So I'm very excited for this volume to come out. Hopefully Dr. Kemmerling will announce it when it comes out, and will announce it back to everyone who is interested in reading that.
Indeed. Let's hope that it will come out soon, and we will know not only more about digitalization, but also about all this complexity that comes with digitalizing such a matter as society.
Right. So with that, we have reached the end of our episode for today's podcast. A few little announcements. I would like to start by welcoming our new members of the Brandt School family. First off, we have a new research professor for democratic institutions of the Global South who is going to be joining the Brandt School family, Professor Mariana Llanos. Yeah. We also have 2 new research fellows who are going to be joining. First off, we have Dr. Jasmine Lorge, who is going to be our postdoctoral fellow with research focus on the role of civil society in weak states. I am particularly very excited about that. We also have a second new research fellow who's going to be joining the Brandt School, Dr. Nasser Tulba, who is an expert in education policy analysis, who will also be joining our Brandt School. Very exciting time. I'm very excited for next fall when we're going to be able to meet and interact with all these new people at the Brandt School.
So good to have a new family, new members on the family of the Willy Brandt School from many parts of the world, from Latin America, from Europe, from Africa, from everywhere.
Yeah, right. So, Jesus, did you watch Eurovision?
I did watch Eurovision and it was amazing.
You thought so?
It was great. I didn't expect the Italians to win, but it was such a good surprise.
Nobody did. Who were you rooting for?
I was rooting for France. I must say that I have a little piece in my heart for chanson française. But hey, they got second, she got second, and that's good for me.
She still got it, huh? What did you think about the German player?
I sincerely liked it. I don't know why it got so few points.
Everyone all over my Twitter is saying, thank God for the UK so that Germany wasn't last. It was a very interesting weekend with Eurovision. I'm always very excited, especially when you're in Europe. Eurovision becomes such an exciting thing and such an exciting tradition. So with that, we have reached the end of our episode for today. Jesus, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. Thank you everyone for all our listeners, and we'll see you on the next one.
See ya.
Bye-bye.